Hello, and welcome to the panel on governance implementation organized by the Smart Contract Research Forum, or SCRF, as part of the Smart Contract Summit. I'm Eugene Leventhal, the operations lead here at SCRF. This is actually part one of the panel, as the conversation was just too good to cut short. You'll be able to read more about the panelists and to watch the rest of the video for free at smartcontractresearch.org/t/621. And with that, I'll pass it on to our moderator for this panel, Kelsey Nabin.
Thank you for having me. So my name's Kelsey. I'm a researcher at RMIT University in Melbourne, Australia. I'm connected with the Centre for Automated Decision Making and Society, as well as the Blockchain Innovation Hub and Digital Ethnography Research Centre. So I have the pleasure of handing around the virtual room to introduce each of our panelists today and hopefully helping to facilitate a really engaging discussion on governance implementation and what's happening with DAOs in the blockchain space. So starting with Connor, please tell us a little bit more about yourself and what that has to do with DAOs.
Thanks, Kelsey. Yeah, so formerly a lawyer, helped co-found the Blockchain Association back a few years ago, now the biggest industry and lobbying association in the United States for blockchain. And on the DAO side, really got it particularly interested when I wrote an article with Jesse Walden around scaling crypto companies and looking to the precedent of cooperatives in order to think through some of the principles that we might apply in scaling crypto companies, and then thought more critically about actually how could we start having DAOs come together to jointly fund research and ultimately end up founding the DAO Research Cooperative, where we're doing just that.
Excellent. Leighton.
Yeah, well, no, Connor, I can say I've read that article. That was a really good article. Yeah. So yeah, my name's Leighton, and I am involved in a few different DAOs. Pool Together is one that I'm probably most heavily involved in, and that's a protocol that moved to tokenized governance in February of this year. So that's the one that I am still most heavily involved in. But additional to that, I'm involved in a Venture DAO, which is a on-chain, essentially angel investment group, and then a DAO called Pleaser DAO, which is a NFT art collection DAO. So that's my experience as it's relevant to DAOs.
Great to have you here. Scott Moore, tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Awesome. Hey, everyone. My name is Scott. Currently, I'm a co-founder of a project called Gitcoin, which was started in 2017 with the goal of hopefully funding open source software development for the time being. That has meant mostly funding public goods in the Web3 ecosystem. Recently, we've exited to community towards that goal. My history before Gitcoin actually involved a bit around DAOs in 2015-16 with a project that shortly after, unrelated to the DAO hack, ended up not really being very interesting as people started to think more deeply about what we were trying to do with DAOs, and now it really feels like, although we're not there yet, there's definitely been there's been a lot of progress made, which is awesome. So excited to talk about that. And Seth, I'll maybe pass it to you.
Hi there, my name is Seth Fry. I'm a professor at the University of California, Davis, and I specialize in the study of governance systems, mostly online governance systems like World of Warcraft communities, self-hosted Minecraft servers, subreddit, Reddit communities. I was trained originally as a cognitive scientist. To do cognitive science, to understand, people, you need thousands or hundreds or maybe millions of people, and you got to be able to compare them. So from my perspective, to do social science, to study societies, you need a societal unit of analysis. You need an opportunity to study lots of independent instantiations of communities, or in my case, governance systems. And so the proliferation of DAOs and the very frothy high iteration exploration that's happening in this community is a lot of what's brought me here today.
Thanks. Look forward to exploring that more. Rich Brown.
Hi, my name is Rich Brown. I currently am the co-founder of the Smart Contract Research Forum. It's a venue devoted to connecting researchers, academics, and industry together to push the space forward. Previously, I was the head of community at MakerDAO for 3-4 years. helped architect basically all the things that were traditionally related to a community, but also significant amount of time was spent in the proto-governance stage of MakerDAO. So I have some insights into some of the mechanism designs there. Before that, I co-founded a cooperative, a multi-stakeholder cooperative in the real world, as a real business, with 1,500 photographers, which is still running today. And before that, I ran a 300-person pirate corporation in EVE Online, which you might, or Seth, you might have some insights into, where I learned most of my community building skills. Actually, I've just been coasting on those since then. So that's my thing.
It's interesting that you should mention online cooperatives in relation to your kind of DAO resume. So why would or wouldn't communities want to consider a DAO, and why is it now that blockchain communities are really kind of interested in investing in governance?
So I definitely think that the Metaverse sort of like conversation, which we're sort of bringing up here with EVE Online and World of Warcraft and so forth, is pretty relevant here. Like, especially during the pandemic, I think people started to really understand the reasoning behind the popularity of those sorts of organizations, which like this fringe sort of or roughly more fringe group earlier on already did. I definitely also grew up sort of like playing World of Warcraft and like helped run guilds and raids and so forth. And that experience was like formative to the point where it didn't seem strange to me to like interact with a whole bunch of random people that I don't know online towards like some common goal. So the idea of like the Ethereum ecosystem never really seemed that strange to me. And it's interesting that like it does seem strange, or like prior to the pandemic did seem strange to so many people. But I think now there's a lot more understanding of the ability for people to coordinate online being like a core primitive of just like where we're at as a society. And I think that it's naturally going to be a kind of thing that like progresses over time. We probably still have a lot of work to do in terms of like, you know, when we talk about people creating DAOs, the question arises, like, what is a DAO, right? And I don't think we're there yet in terms of really having like to something that Rich was saying just before we sort of started, like a formal definition of like what or instantiation of what a digital cooperative should be in the future. But I think we're certainly making a lot of progress there. And I think that there's certainly been an acceleration just in this general idea of people coordinating online to like generate value being like a normalized thing. The other last example I'll just very quickly mention is Roblox, which is like now obviously a public company, now obviously very popular. And like, even I think that's part of the reason we're seeing like traditional Web2 folks, like even the standard sort of like DC Twitter folks, like now caring about this space. So I'll pause there, but that's certainly been my journey, I guess. And it's I think to me, one of the reasons we're seeing so much popularity in this concept now.
I think just jumping a little bit on Scott's thought, like, and you alluded to it as you were introing Kelsey, and we also heard Rich talk about his participation both with online communities and then in cooperatives. Like it just strikes me that a lot of the people who are interested, it's almost the perfect opportunity for people who are interested in cooperatives to collaborate with people who are interested in online communities, because both different forums have so much important precedent to provide to those who are now thinking of setting up DAOs, and also determining what DAOs are. I mean, I think we've all alluded to that. Like, there's no clear definition as to what a DAO is, and there's a lot of different thoughts about what that could be. And that is an incredible ambition, I think, of someone to take on that task to define DAO in a way that's meaningful and important to the community. And I'm doing a thing right now with the DAO Research Cooperative where we're trying to identify some of the most pressing issues for DAOs, thinking broadly like legal issues, governance issues, treasury management issues. And in a couple of the initial calls I had, that was the first thing that folks brought up. Like, I'm talking to different leaders in the space, and it's what is the definition of a DAO, whether it's related to the kinds of systems that a particular organization uses, or the kinds of obligations it has to its members, or a large variety of things. So when we think about why DAOs are popular, I think in part DAOs are popular because the definition of DAO is so broad that anything is a DAO today. but we might see a fall off in popularity when we may, start defining it more narrowly, or at least creating subcategories for DAOs.
Well, I don't want to put you on the spot though, but can you get us started? What is your definition of a DAO? What's your working definition when you're speaking to these people?
Ooh, that's so tough. I really don't want to dodge the question. And so maybe I won't I just think that we're at such an early stage of experimentation that we've yet to figure out what a DAO is, candidly. And I know that's kind of a shady answer, but I was actually talking to a guy, a VC earlier today, and I was asking him about, when you're talking to organizations that you're looking to invest in, and they intend to ultimately become DAOs or like Dexit, how do you think about the way in which they're composing their DAO? How do you think about their timeline for decentralizing into a DAO? And that was really his response is, we're so early here that we actually don't even ask that question, because we just don't think that someone could give us a serious answer. And candidly, I'm a little bit of the same mind. I was talking to Julia Rosenberg from Orca, and she's thought very critically about this sort of stuff. And she was the first one to bring this up to me as a big issue. And from her perspective, and I don't want to misquote her here, but she was talking about uses of particular systems. So when I think about that, I would want, a forum for proposals. I would want voting mechanisms. I wouldn't just want a Telegram group. And so to me, it maybe very broadly is an organization that allows for decentralized governance, decentralized voting, but I would leave that very broad, because I also have kind of a specific view on what members of a DAO should be able to vote for. And I'm not a huge believer in kind of a one token governance system either. So what we define as DAOs broadly today, I may not totally agree with. And I imagine that's probably the same for most people on this call.
I like that though, because at the moment, and we're talking about this process of how you get to a DAO, I like the Dexit acronym, so short for exit to DAO, which is a take on Nathan Schneider's exit to community. But they're not decentralized yet in many instantiations, and they're not autonomous. They're kind of organizations. And I think a lot of the blockchain community is trying to figure out what is an organization? Leighton, you mentioned a suite of DAOs that you're involved in. What's the varying mission or objective or goals of these different groups?
Yeah. So I think I draw I draw one line very clearly in my DAO involvement. So pooled together, I wouldn't really call it a DAO, to be honest, because to me, it's a protocol that has tokenized governance. And some people call those DAOs, but I don't think of those as DAOs like Compound, Uniswap, even Maker. If you're familiar with these protocols pooled together, I think of it as a protocol with tokenized governance, whereas Venture DAO and Pleaser DAO, they both have DAO in the name, I think of those as DAOs. And the difference in my mind is Venture DAO and Pleaser DAO are a group of people who came together to sort of actively go do new things. Whereas Pool Together is a protocol that was already established, already had hundreds of millions of dollars in it, already was functioning, and the control was just given of an existing self-perpetuating project to the community. And I think that's a very different thing than, in my experience in Pleaser DAO and Venture DAO, is they immediately become very hierarchical. But Pool Together is not. And it doesn't have to be, because there's a very narrow space that we're making decisions about. And because we're not debating completely arbitrary subjects like we are in Pleaser DAO and Venture DAO. So that's how I think of them differently, which I'd be curious to hear Seth's input, because I think I would be curious how that maps to maybe categories in a more academic sense, but that's at least from my personal experience.
Let's see. Well, categories. So I think that I have something a bit akin to folks here. This aversion even to defining a DAO, I think it's perfectly legitimate and from my perspective, encouraged to end with definitions rather than start with them. To have a word be the name of the thing you're trying to understand. It's consistent with a very iterative, empirical kind of approach that sort of represent, typical of the kind of experimentation that we see here. And in line with that, all governance taxonomies that I encounter in my work, I'd say most of my effort goes into trying to break them or push them, and I'm still struggling. As you go across domains from a physical, real world, let's say nation state system, which is where a lot of our taxonomies come from, to a small scale self-governing system. I actually also got my start organizing cooperatives and moved into the online space after that because it's easier to do data science on. I'm originally out of the housing co-op sector. So taxonomies of small-scale governance systems, and then moving on to that into the emergent taxonomies of online communities, how they understand the differences between themselves. We are still not at a place where there's any kind of unified taxonomy or ontology, I could say, of the axes along which governance systems vary. And so I'm inclined, to everyone's disappointment, to come just as much as a watcher and observer than a holder forth.
Have you been tempted to, so the co-op space has been examined for the last 400 or 500 years, and there's a lot of subdivisions and categorizations and definitions there. Have you been tempted to sort of use those as templates to the new DAO ecosystem, or do you find that it doesn't translate?
Well, you know what? It's a really pleasant surprise to find so many people here coming with some kind of co-op background or interest in, in my understanding, I'm still figuring out the kind of mapping of ideological backgrounds of people in this space to the subset of kind of blockchain applications that they tap into. I do have one kind of litmus test I use for kind of knowing where to start talking to a person, which is, okay, visualize utopia. It exists. Let's say utopia exists and we're in it and it runs out of a building. My question for a lot of people tends to be, are there any people in the building? So is governance a system that runs itself, or is it inevitably something that we're involved in, that we use as a set of tools to govern ourselves, that we're active in the work of governance? And one kind of sense I'm getting already from at least the folks in this small circle is that a lot of you end up more in the idea that it doesn't run itself, that we're active in the acts of governance. So if anyone wants to not be pigeonholed by me, I'd love to hear that.
So that's helpful. And to the point about the name referring to autonomy or not, Aaron Wright recently said in a Stanford piece that there are two main types of DAOs, participatory and algorithmic. But really, in what we've all described, there's both participation, or it's not a DAO, and there's also algorithms. So there's something happening through smart contracts and kind of automation there. So what are your views towards how much, or what, I guess, what's being automated? To Seth's point, is it the people being automated out of the system, or is it certain levels or functions kind of being automated to give autonomy to the people in the DAO? And then what does that actually mean?
I'll do a quick answer on that, because so like the idea of social scalability, like Nick Szabo's essay on that from, I don't know, the late 90s, was definitely a super influential piece on all my work I've done. And what caught my attention about that piece is that basically his thesis is like smart contracts lower the cost of trust. And so what's being automated is the human trust that's required to broker relationships. And when you can lower trust, when you can lower the cost of trust of entering into new relationships, you can have more relationships. And I think the ideal world, you can have like a more flourishing social reality, because you're able to be in more relationships with more different people groups, because the trust, the need to, the trust is what's being automated. So that's my 2 cents on it.
I definitely think that there's something to that notion. In particular, we aren't very good, Seth would know this much better than me, but like Dunbar's number is a really important concept here, where once you scale past 150 people, it's very difficult to actually have any idea of who those people are, or to have really defined relationships with them. And I think what we sort of designed, even beyond like the idea of DAOs, like in traditional structures, is this idea of like, well, what if we put in like structures around voting, around like what it means to participate in the system that are more formalized and less sort of like normative, I suppose. And those structures sort of act as scaffolding that allows us to more easily coordinate with like a larger group, because there's like processes that we can all agree on, even if we don't necessarily like know each other. And that like is the scaffolding, to Leighton's point, it's like providing that trust layer. And so historically, that was very kind of opaque. It was just like, okay, well, these people have sort of decided on these rules, and so I guess that's fine now, and now we can all abide by them. Like, we can trust these people in like the tower to decide what these things are. And like in theory, I wouldn't say necessarily in practice yet with DAOs where they are, that's sort of what we're, to Leighton's point, automating.
I would say just kind of adding on to that and thinking about the way that different DAOs, I really like the idea of the trust created by smart contracts allowing for scalability, and even other tooling like just the governance mechanisms, and even single token like in Uniswap or in Compound, for instance, the creation of grants programs. So grants programs are obviously, there's a huge part, at least in those two organizations. There's a grants committee, and they make assessments about projects, and then they decide to fund them or to not fund them. And so there was a vote done at initial stages as to whether or not those committees should be funded. And in looking at MakerDAO too, and I know Rich could speak more to this, but as I understand it, when MakerDAO decentralized or became a DAO and maybe left the foundation world, there might be other structural pieces I'm not totally familiar with there, but some of the functions were allocated to or assigned to new organizations. And so there were just different organizations under the Treasury or the DAO, however you want to state it. And so you members of the DAO, and this isn't specific to Maker, are able to make some decisions about allocating responsibility to other people. And this is potentially where the co-op structure becomes really important. As Rich mentioned, there's 400 or 500 years of exploration there. And so we appreciate that cooperatives have members, but the members don't make every single decision. They assign decisions to management. And so in that same way, we're seeing assignment of different responsibilities, sometimes to organizations and at other times to potentially individuals and DAOs.
Rich?
Sorry, I was muted. So it relates to something that Leighton was talking about earlier, where some DAOs are protocol management DAOs, and it's largely governance mechanisms around binary decision trees, basically. So we vote for this, we vote for that. Then there's engagements or creative, and the list goes on and on. But from the co-op model, that you're kind of decentralizing or taking a committee model to a business unit. And so that's one of the ways that these more complicated, or to a business organization, that's why some of these more complicated organizations are able to maintain themselves with more egalitarian decision-making processes, which in my mind kind of raises the question, and you triggered me with the Maker question, because as an organization becomes more and more complex, and all of its decision-making responsibilities get spun out to the community, is there an upper limit on the complexity of a DAO? Is it possible to scale, or are you sort of 3 steps past the protocol management level? Then maybe it's time to look at a firm instead, or does this group believe that the DAOs can scale?
That's interesting. That, because for me that brings up a little bit of a tension almost between where Rich is and where Leighton, Scott, and Connor are. For among Leighton, Scott, and Connor, it sort of seemed like there's an understanding that that trust didn't used to be scalable, and now it's scalable. But a little bit where Rich is coming from is, well, centralization is a great way to scale things. And because we have a background, because society has a history of centralization, scale hasn't really been the problem. We have scalable trust. There's centrally managed reputation systems. There's centrally managed currencies and centrally kind of architected, engineered market economies. And so then, so I'm curious, is there a conflict here? Is there a proposal that a decentralized scheme is ultimately more scalable than a centralized scheme? Are we challenging the scalability of centralized schemes? Or as Rich is kind of possibly indicating, is the goal to get decentralized schemes as scalable as centralized schemes, and on top of that, expressing all the other benefits of decentralization?
Well, I was kind of hoping that Scott would jump in, because if I look at my crystal ball, Gitcoin is heading down sort of the same road. So these are the challenges staring him directly in the face. So do you have some insights, Scott?
Definitely, yeah. I think that's a fair assessment. My view would be that you have easy access to scale when you're centralized. Like it's very easy to scale, but it's simultaneously, I think, much more fragile than if you had a decentralized system, in the sense that like you don't actually have any kind of like redundancy against corruption. Basically, if like that centralized authority starts acting in some way that's incorrect or against the norms, or like is illegitimate, or anything like that, like you run into an immediate collapse of like that system, or maybe not always immediate, but like an eventual slow decline of that system. And that's what you see in like every country where there's being a government that's being active. It suddenly like doesn't really deal with the people, or like have like any really connections to the people. And those sorts of situations tend to be much more damaging than if you had a system that was like slightly less scalable, but like kind of a bit more robust and a bit more like functionally accountable, I suppose. So I think there's trade-offs in those models, like between like how much executive function do you have and like how much sort of legislative function do you have and so forth. But like, I think one of the things we've learned from, and like the reason that like, I think democracies sort of are the prominent like sort of examples of governments that we have today is not because like they're perfect options. It's because like they're like kind of a least bad option, and they kind of aren't great, but like they kind of work, and like we don't have a better, in my mind, option at the moment.
I think a really, Scott mentioned something which will trigger something for me, which is also in thinking about centralized systems, if you could develop partially centralized systems that have some level of checks and balances. Like we think about government, and there are 3 different branches of government, and the courts, watch Congress, and the president watches the court, executive, judicial, and congressional is the third. But can we do something similar with DAOs and the corporation? Similar thing, board members and then executives. So some level of oversight, and then shareholders as well have certain rights too. So this is something that Justin wrote about in part, was when we're thinking about completely, like for instance, maybe one extreme being token holders making every decision about how a treasury is used. And so instead of having a treasury management committee, which specializes in thinking really critically about every decision made, should we diversify and invest in a certain amount of stable coins and invest in a certain amount of tokens from other protocols, et cetera, you have the entire community making decisions. And so we could easily say, okay, that's not incredibly scalable. And then when we think about other functions too, like legal, for instance, if at some point you need to think about, okay, we're diversifying our treasury, what are the tax consequences of doing that? Who is the counterparty who's going to pay the IRS, because they're going to be coming for us eventually? If you have, decentralized community, who is getting the memo from the lawyer? Because all of a sudden it's no longer privileged or confidential, and it could be used as evidence against you. So there are just a number of different ways that it can be very problematic to be fully decentralized in the way the world works today. So I think it would be hard to say that it's maximally efficient. Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. Yeah, deal flow. Anything that requires some discretion is going to be tough in a DAO model, I believe.
So it's interesting to think about some of those kind of values-based or kind of ideological approaches to governance, but we've got some experts here in terms of actual experience of DAOing and trying to do decentralized governance. What are some of the challenges or strengths that are emerging in your personal experiences?
Not to jump in again, but one thing that actually really came up from that last comment was, it's funny because we did run into a very similar example of that problem with there was this whole Akita situation that's emerged, in which, for those that aren't familiar, there's kind of this history of people giving random tokens to Vitalik. And, generally, it's not very favorable for Vitalik because he just gets these random tokens, and then he's kind of like promoted as part of these like schemes, and it becomes kind of an issue. In the Akita situation, it was kind of interesting because these original, I guess, like founders of this token had like dropped these, and then they had exit scammed at some point. So these other folks kind of like started rallying the community, and got to a point where during sort of the last peak of the market, there were just like almost 100,000 people that were like part of this DAO token community. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because eventually Vitalik gave a bunch of these tokens to things like COVID India relief, to a lot of longevity related organizations, and to us, to Gitcoin. And to Gitcoin, we got 50% of the supply of this Akita token. And it was entirely public in terms of how the community was deciding what to do with these tokens. And they originally just sort of said, well, we'll kind of sell these, like we'll be done with it. And what they didn't realize is like that decision was being made in an adversarial environment where everyone else was able to see that information. And so what that meant is that like the Akita community responded. There was a kind of prisoner's dilemma of sorts that emerged. And like we had to kind of like, the community of the DAO had to figure out like basically what does it mean to go from like a effect sort of state to a cooperative state. And eventually that happened, which was pretty cool to see in practice. But like having these sort of executive committees in place would have probably been preferable for that kind of decision. And so that's actually been something that's been formatted into the DAO structure now, with these ideas of work streams and kind of like these executive bodies that can make particular decisions while still being accountable to the overall organization.
For context, Gitcoin had been a DAO for like a number of weeks when this vote was going on. And what was that treasury worth? What was the value of the Akita dog tokens?
Well, that's a tricky part, because like people say like 500 million, but it was not that much, because really the spot price of this sort of thing was not the same as liquidity. Liquidity was very low. It was maybe in the range of 5 million, 10 million. But to your point, it's a lot of money for a DAO like has just like come into existence to be like, how are we supposed to manage this treasury? What are we doing? And so it was certainly like, I was actually surprised that it even got to a point where it was something meaningful done with those, like given that it was like a 2-week thing. None of these, the stewards, the sort of representative democracy system that was put in place based on this retroactive distribution. And eventually the stewards, who sort of roughly knew of each other through that process, but didn't really know much about each other, coordinated on this, which was kind of wild to see. But it's a very good case where executive functions.
Is there maybe a trade-off here? So, in a traditional business, these are decisions that happen in the boardroom. Nobody ever hears about it on the assembly line. But in the DAO space, have we replaced lobbying and public appeals and forum threads for committee decision or board decision? Is that because I followed the threads? They were enormously entertaining from my perspective. Sorry, Scott. When it was all happening.
No,
seeing this all play out in public in education.
I'll let Leighton jump in. I saw him put his hand up, but I would just say, like, I definitely think there's a balance between executive function and legislative function. It's a question of what that proper balance is, which is the hard question. But sorry, Leighton. Go.
I wasn't actually trying to raise my hand. I think I was doing something, but I think I was smiling because Rich, what I was honing in on what you just said was that DAOs still have a lot of back channels. Like there still is like a lot of like, oh, before I propose this, I'm going to like ask this person, or like, oh, I'm going to tell this person, like, so that's sort of what I was picking up on, Rich.
Well, I don't want to go down this road too far because there's a lot of interesting things to talk about, but that was very early on in the maker development. It became apparent to us on the inside that at some point in the future, DAO lobbyists are going to be a thing. And I think that the ecosystem is kind of waking up to this. And I don't think that we're that far away from literal lobbyists, like agencies whose job it is to get votes put through in various organizations, because it's public opinion now, and that's directly responsible. It's almost, well, I'm hesitant to say it's more effective than in traditional democracies, but we see direct financial incentives for votes to occur, and that's a very motivating force. And so lobbying, I think, is underappreciated how important that is in our space right now.
At this kind of level of abstraction, at this kind of strange mapping, the idea of lobbyists isn't going to be super different from the idea of a political party. Maybe in this metaphor, a party is just a lobby where the participants are also lobbyists. And so the literature in political science talks about how political parties exist to kind of coordinate units at different levels. And of course, there's skeptics about political parties, but there's this surprisingly large literature that's quite sort of optimistic about the importance of political parties as another kind of agent in a polycentric governance system, doing a lot of coordination work and lining up work, as well as like in the case of nation states, like a talent finding and elevating kind of role.
Mm.
You've seen some engaged participants, Leighton, in your ecosystem as well, with governance token allocations with various pools as well. Did you see any sign of lobbying pulled together?
I don't think we've seen it yet. Not in any formalized way. No, but I do
hierarchy before too. If you could talk to that as well.
Yeah. I mean, I think I have like an unspoken idea that like DAOs are not hierarchical, or they shouldn't be. And I don't know if we would agree with that or not. But my finding has been that like in DAOs that are not associated with like protocols, they become very hierarchical very fast, because I don't think we have a way. I haven't experienced a way to like organize people and get stuff done without hierarchy. And maybe that's just my capitalist brainwashing, but like I haven't seen it yet. So yeah, the only other comment I was going to make too is one. I think an interesting dynamic I've seen in DAOs is that almost no one votes against anything. Like it's very rare to have controversial votes, and so it creates this weird bias where sort of whoever it is, I think to like Rich's, I think Rich, you're sort of getting at this a little bit. Like there's definitely a risk factor of like the people who are just paying attention can sort of push through whatever they want, because 99% of people aren't paying attention, or maybe 10% of people are paying attention, and that 10%, they just don't want to be negative. They don't want to vote against something. So like with Pool Together, like we'll have a good debate in the forums, but when it actually comes to voting, generally speaking, it's like 99% to 1%.
And this sort of gets a subtle thing about governance and rules that is going, in my imagination, is going to represent kind of design challenges, and that's that. We kind of, especially for in the governance space, we think that rules are really important. We think of rules as the figure against the ground of possible action, especially if you have a very mechanism kind of focused view of governance. Then we define behavior in the system by defining rules. But a funny thing happened to some colleagues of mine who were doing actually ABM, so agent-based modeling of governance systems. And what they found was that they define a sort of virtual resource and virtual behavior with virtual incentives, and then they define rules. And what they found is that rules got triggered actually very rarely. That rules were rules are just there to manage edge cases. Rules tend to be there. Rule violation and policy subtleties tend to be there for the weird things that happen. For the most part, the system kind of runs itself. People do their things under an overall framework. But the actual need for conflict resolution mechanisms, for example, is pretty rare. And I guess that's encouraging from the perspective of a community that's skeptical about the importance or the need for rules and hierarchy, that wants to offer a lot of freedom to a lot of people under a trusting environment. But it's probably going to be challenging from a design perspective, because it's going to reduce the rate at which you get signal about your governance design.
Yeah. It seems like the mechanism for resolving conflict in DAOs is exiting. Like I think that's like all I've seen so far. It's like whoever ends up with the disagreement.
Failure in itself, though, right? If that's the last thing you want, isn't it? People. Sorry,
I guess I'm not saying what it should be, but I'm saying like I feel like that's the reality. Is like if it's like the people who wanted that's like Ethereum Classic and Ethereum, and Bitcoin and like ECH and like Bitcoin and like it's just like it's exiting and forking.
Okay, so you mean capital E exit as opposed to just wandering away from the table. So like wandering away from your ecosystem would be bad.
Well,
I do think
I mean,
both of those happen. Just to be sure,
Yeah,
like
both.
there's like a lack of participation is a huge problem in these systems in a lot of cases. Like I actually would note, like so far we've had like 3 contentious votes of like 6 total votes or so.
Thanks for tuning in to the first half of the discussion on governance implementation. If you want to see the rest of the panel, if you want to learn more about our panelists, or if you want to be part of our long-tail discussion on the topic, check out smartcontractresearch.org/T/621. Thanks again, and enjoy the rest of the summit.
Thank you, Rich, and everybody from SCURF and joining into that conversation about governance. It's always interesting to see how community is evolving and how communities are working.